Previously, we talked about the activity class, and I showed you how one activity can programmatically start another activity by first creating an intent object and then by passing that intent to a method such as start activity or start activity for result. Today we are going to recapitulate on intent class. We will discuss how they are created and processed as they are used in starting other activities. I will begin by presenting the intent class. I will talk about how they are created, what fields they have, and what information those fields contain. After that, I will talk about the two types of intents. First, I will talk about explicit intents, in which intents specifically name the activity they want to start. And second, I will talk about implicit intent, where intent don't select the target activity but instead describe the operation they want to be performed. After which Android finds and then start the activity that can perform that operation. After that, I will discuss the process of intent resolution in regards to implicit intent. Then I will talk about the intent filters and their importance in implicit intents. And then lastly, I will briefly look into pending intents. The intent class is basically an abstract description of at least two purposes in Android. One, it can specify an operation that you want to perform. And two, it can represent an event that has occurred in the system that you want to notify other components about. In this lecture, we are going to focus on just the first of these, and that is using intent to specify operations that you want performed. And we'll leave the second of these, using intent for an event notification, for a later lesson when we talk about broadcast receivers. You can think of intents as providing a kind of language for specifying operations that you want to have performed. In essence, intents give you an easy way to say things like I want to select a contact, I want to take a photo, I want to dial a phone number, or I want to display a map. So in practice, intents are usually constructed by one component, mostly activities, that wants some work to be done, and then Android uses that intent to start another component that can perform the desired work. So let's talk about the kinds of information that can be specified within an intent. For example, we'll talk about intent fields including action, data, category, type, target component, extras, and flags. An intent's action field is a string that represents or names the operation to be performed. Some built-in examples include action underscore dial, which means I want some component to dial a phone number. Action underscore edit, which means I want some component to display some data for the user to edit. And action underscore main, which means I want to start an activity as the initial activity of an application. You can set an intent's action in several ways. For example, you can pass an action string as a parameter to the intent constructor. Alternatively, you can create an empty intent and then call the setAction method on it, passing the action string again as a parameter. Intents also has a data field which represents data that is associated with the intent. Now that data is formatted as a uniform resource identifier or URI. And one example of intent data is a geo-schemed URI which indicates map data. Another example is a tel schemed URI indicating a phone number that you want dialed. And note that the strings that represents the underlying data are first being passed through the URI.parse method, which takes the string and then returns a URI object. You can set the intents data in a variety of ways. For instance, you can pass it directly into the intents constructor, or you can create an empty intent and then use the set data method to set the data for that intent. Intents also have a type field, which specifies the MIME type of the intent data. Some example of MIME types include various image formats, for example, image slash PNG for PNG images and image slash JPEG for JPG or JPEG images. There are also various text formats such as text slash HTML for HTML text or text slash plain for arbitrary text data. And of course, if you don't specify a MIME type, Android will try to infer one for you. You can set an intent MIME type by using the setType method passing in a string that represents the desired MIME type. You can also set both the data and the type together by calling the setDataAndType method. The intent category represents additional information about the kinds of component that can handle or should handle this intent. Some examples include category underscore browsable, which means that the activity can be invoked by a browser via URI link. Another example is category underscore launcher, which means that the target activity can be the initial activity of a task and is listed in the top level application launcher. You can specify the category using add category method. Intents also have a component field that identifies the intent's target activity. And you can set this field if you know that there is exactly one activity that should always receive this intent. By specifying this attribute, all of the other intent attributes becomes optional. You can set the intent's target component using one of the intent's constructors by passing in a context object and a class object which represents the activity that should perform the desired operation. You can also create an empty intent and then use one of the methods such as set component, set class, or set class name to set the target activity. Intents also have an extras field. Extras store additional information associated with the intent to accomplish requested operation. Extras are effectively a map of key value pairs. The target activity has to know both the name and the type of any extra data that it intends to use. There are several different forms of put extra method for setting extras, and the specific form of these methods will depend on the type of data you want to store. So for example, there's one form for storing a string, one form for storing an array of floats, and so on. You can also bundle this data using bundle data structure and use put extras method to set it. Another intent field is called flags. Flags represent information about how the intent should be handled. Some built-in examples include flag activity no history, which means that when an activity is started based on this intent, it shouldn't be put in the history stack. As soon as the user navigates from it, the activity is finished and on activity result is never invoked. Flags can be set using the method setFlags.